And what's going on, everyone? Cabana Greg here, and today's video is going to be about indie video game soundtracks. I've been wanting to do a video game soundtrack video for a long time, but really didn't know where to start, and I figured it out finally. I'm going to be breaking up my favorite video game soundtracks by genre, or classification, or what have you. So I'm going to be doing FPS video game soundtracks, I'm going to be doing JRPG video game soundtracks, horror game soundtracks, the list goes on. So today we're going to be focusing on indie game soundtracks, and there are a lot of great ones, and that's why I have a huge list of honorable mentions. So buckle up, because this is about to get intense. Here we go. Gone Home, Owlboy, Night in the Woods, Fury, Hyperlight Drifter, Machinima, this game, Bastion, Stardew Valley, and What Remains of Edith Finch. It's a lot of honorable mentions, for sure. The ones that you'll see on my list, really love those soundtracks, love those games, and I can't wait to talk more about them in the videos. And yeah, please enjoy.
Fez. The music of Fez fits the game perfectly and complements it in every possible way. Disasterpeace has created a synthy, moody set of excellent chiptune tracks, each as good as the last. Now, when the chiptune movement started, plenty of producers were making retro songs that would have been perfect for an NES, but Rich Vreeland, aka Disasterpeace, bent and broke the rules of that sound for Fez. Vreeland's music took its sweet, beautiful time creating settings that wavered between ominous and curious. This is still his best standalone work, but it's no surprise that someone caught on to the game eventually and hired him to score It Follows, one of my favorite horror films. Fez's soundtrack will still live on as one of the best chiptune soundtracks of all time and one of the greatest indie soundtracks. Next up, we have Hotline Miami. Now, Hotline Miami is a very interesting game where the music hooked me before I even started playing the game. As soon as I booted it up for the first time, I knew I was in for a treat. It's a wicked cool, incredibly fun game, and it sports one of the best soundtracks I've ever listened to. But in the first Hotline Miami soundtrack, it was well received because it had a great mix of surreal, dreamy pop and pounding, high-octane electronic fun. While the Hotline Miami series wears its violent slasher movie influences quite proudly on its sleeve, there's a very cyberpunk approach to the mutability of reality present in the game's deftly portrayed score. The soundtrack features some of the best aggressive electronic music being made today, and that is why it's on the list. Next is Kentucky Route Zero. Now, Kentucky Route Zero is a contemporary point-and-click adventure, but underneath it's much more than that. A surreal tale in which a character called Conway attempts to deliver a parcel for the antiques company that he works for through beautifully drawn but bleak locations and a number of odd encounters. It's a game that captures that feeling of driving along an empty road in a remote location in the dead of night. Ben Babbitt's score paints that feeling not as something to fear, but as something comforting. Its droning and sometimes haunting score unfolds like a poem and put me in a mindset that no other game has in a long time. This game still remains as one of my favorite indie games of all time and also has one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. I highly recommend that you guys check this game out. If you're not interested in point and click games, that's totally fine, but at least give the soundtrack a listen because it truly is something special. Next we have Oxenfree, which is one of the biggest surprises in all of game soundtracks. Oxenfree's soundtrack is an electronica daydream that fades into a bumping nightmare. It's an oral interpretation of the sun setting over an abandoned beachside military base packed with deadly secrets. In other words, it's perfectly suited to the game's haunting storyline. It's a soundtrack that's heavily varied and doesn't just settle for one tone throughout. The songs make me think of childhood, death, and the supernatural. Most tracks sound like a scary ghost story, something you'd play around a dark campfire, for example. Oxenfree has one of the most original and creative soundtracks I've ever listened to, and I still find myself humming the game's main tune. Totally recommend you check it out. Next we have Virginia, which is a game I actually did a video review for a little while back, but Virginia plays out like a indie movie, and the soundtrack is no exception. It's probably one of the most polished and best sounding indie scores I've ever heard. Throughout the game, not a single word of dialogue is spoken. Instead, the game's score serves to comment on the game's unfolding narrative, and that's probably the best thing about Virginia, in addition to its surreal imagery. The dreamlike images you come across in Virginia are set to a synth-stroked soundtrack, somewhere between the nostalgic and the ethereal. Its movements often overlaid by a gentle, yearning guitar whose reverb echoes about these strange and often surreal scenarios. The soundtrack is just as good as any AAA game. In fact, it rivals and sometimes surpasses some of the other stuff I've heard in larger full retail games. That is why Virginia's soundtrack is on this list. It truly is remarkable. It perfectly complements the game's overarching narrative and is more of a character than anything else, especially since there is no line of dialogue that's ever spoken. You rely heavily on the visuals and, more importantly, the auditory information that you're given through the score and through the sound effects and through the overall sound design. Next up, we have Ori and the Blind Forest. Now, listening to Ori and the Blind Forest's soundtrack is almost like watching the first 15 minutes of Up.
Oh. Oh. She did.
It can be very, very sad, but it's also calming and tranquil and very, very beautiful. The soundtrack is very similar to Journey's and the emotional impact it had on me while I was playing it. The best thing about this soundtrack has to be the woodwinds. Ori and the Blind Forest makes excellent use of them, including the alto flute, which I didn't realize has an extended curved mouthpiece and a lower tonal range than the traditional flute, and a bensuri, which I, again, had no idea what it was, but it's a South Asian bamboo flute. The score also has a wonderful use of soft, sustained piano and strings, including some great cello. Out of all the tracks in Ori of the Blind Forest, the last two are perhaps my favorite, The Sacrifice and Light of the Noble. They bring together all the greatness in the entire score and are quite emotional. The music rises and flies without limits to the imagination. There's no danger in following it. The cues tell a story, a fairy tale that warms my heart and fills it with love. And if you somehow missed this game and its score, you're doing yourself a disservice. You should totally play it and, more importantly, listen to the soundtrack. Journey. Now, this was a tough one because Austin Wintory is an incredibly gifted composer, and I was going to put Abzu on this list, but I think Journey is my favorite of the two. The soundtrack to Journey makes you feel hopeful, but also somber and insignificant. The most incredible and remarkable thing about Journey's soundtrack was that it's the best-selling soundtrack album on iTunes in all sorts of countries around the world shortly after being released, and it went on to become the first video game soundtrack to be nominated for a Grammy Award. Occasionally, you can hear in a score that it really meant something hugely personal to the composer, while of course they give their best on every project. Now and again, you hear something that seems to just transcend the normal order of things. Austin Wintory's music for Journey is one such transcendental experience. From time to time, I'm sure all of us come across things, books, paintings, films, music, etc., that seem to just speak to us personally, and this is one such occasion for me. This is my favorite album of 2012, of any kind. It's an incredibly moving soundtrack that will continue to touch people years down the road, and it's also a soundtrack that disproves the notion that games can't be artful or aren't forms of art. Just give the Journey soundtrack a listen, and you'll see why. Finally, we have Undertale. Now, Undertale is very interesting considering that the game's creator, Toby Fox, created the entire game himself. It's no surprise that he would create the entire soundtrack himself. But it would probably come to few people's attention of just how amazing the soundtrack is. Not only does it pay homage to the music of many older games, but it manages to reflect the emotion and story through the entire 2-hour runtime. That's pretty damn cool. Almost every song has its own unique style and sound to it. You'll be constantly invested in what the soundtrack manages to deliver. Influences range from games back in the NES days to even some of the more modern classics. While it may not seem as impressive at first glance, the amount of work put into some of the songs showcases the level of talent Toby Fox has as a self-taught musician. The overall sound combines a lot of the older styles of NES video games and mixes it with modern touches of pianos, bass, and electric guitar work. Personally, as someone that really wants to get into composing and, scoring, I really am inspired. So overall, Undertale's soundtrack definitely worth checking out. The game is worth checking out too. It's incredible. But yeah, soundtrack is very impressive. So go ahead and give it a listen. Well, that just about wraps up this video. And like I said, I'm going to be doing other video game soundtrack videos. So if a video game soundtrack that you absolutely love wasn't on this list, chances are it may be on one of my future videos. So yeah, guys, look forward to FPS video game soundtracks, horror video game soundtracks, sci-fi video game soundtracks, and many more. And until next time, I'll see you all on the next video.